Welcome to Catalyst. I think I'm at Gartner already. I've got a little bit of feedback up here, just maybe, I don't know if that's coming through. My name's Mark Diodati, and I am the Research VP and Agenda Manager for the Identity and Access Management practice at Gartner for Technical Professionals. And what I'd like to explore today, you want to start the timer? Just I want to be polite. What I want to explore today is this idea, and it's kind of an emerging idea, about the notion that can the Internet of Things transform the way that we do identity management. And it's early days for this stuff, but it's a topic that's coming up among our client base. And we know certainly that we've had to rethink how we conceptualize devices, right? We used to think about devices as things that we, for example, management like a phone. But now with IoT in particular, with the orchestration of IoT platforms, artificial intelligence and machine learning, we need to start thinking about devices, things that act in our environment and therefore require identity and access management. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. What I'm here to talk about is changing that question around to say, what can IoT do to help with our existing identity and access management infrastructure today? And let's explore a couple of areas. Let's look at the device first of all. One of the things that when you go and you take a look at the devices of today, they're becoming less and less constrained. And for example, if you do work on a Raspberry Pi or a BeagleBone, or you pick a device, that device looks like a Linux server. You SSH in, it's got a file system. You can compile code. It has platform support for Python, you name it. You can run web servers on it. It's at a pretty amazing feat, and it does so at a quite an amazing price, which is at $15, let's say, for a Raspberry Pi device. You can spend less, and when you get that, you get something really interesting. You get a lot of performance. Because these things are sophisticated from let's say, like a mini server perspective, and they support standards-based protocols of IoT. Remember the IoT of old, and really there are hundreds of IoT protocols out there, so it's not gone away. But certainly traditional IoT devices were quite constrained, and therefore you had to think about what kind of protocols you would use, and the protocols became optimized for speed. So with MQTT, for example, one of hundreds of platforms or protocols, but certainly a popular one, it's binary. So unlike running JSON over REST where it's all text-based, right? You take a hit with the text, this is all binary-based. Okay, so that's the device. Let's take a look at what's happening within the IoT platforms. Now, there are two kinds of IoT platforms. There's the straight-ahead, Predix, Bosch, ThingWorx, where it's really truly a platform unto itself. But then also we see folks like GCP, Azure, and AWS integrating IoT platforms with infrastructure as a service. Interesting stuff. Regardless, there are some commonality across both of those market classes. And the first is really repositories. You can use pretty much any repository you want, any kind of database that's there for you. Again, built in, don't have to install it, don't have to recreate the wheel. And these platforms have orchestration layers. So what we're doing with IoT platforms is we're taking a lot of data, we're ingesting it, and we have to take some action on it, typically, right? And so when you look at platforms like AWS, you have Lambda, which is a serverless computing function, right? You can execute code without a server. Azure Functions is quite similar. These are very popular platforms as we move to multi-cloud provider models. All the logging you could ever need, from straight-ahead debug at the API level to more of an information security syslog kind of perspective on activity, you get this for free within the platform as well. Also, something that's becoming more and more important, particularly as we talk about multi-cloud platforms, and most of our clients are multi-cloud platform, is the ability to store credentials outside the programming environment in which they operate. For security reasons, but also for lifecycle reasons, to be able to speed up the changing of those credentials and not have to make the mistakes we made in the past with identity management of embedding credentials everywhere and then having to apply a privileged access management solution. And of course, the emerging area here would be artificial intelligence and machine learning. These are quite nascent, but there is a tremendous amount of synergy associated with them when you think about taking in lots of data and doing intelligent things with it. You combine that with orchestration and AI, ML, and there's a lot you can do. All right, back to our question, how can IoT help with identity management? And as I was thinking about this, it seems clear to me that there are really two things that we do as identity and access management practitioners, right? At Runtime, we do a lot of authenticating of users. We look at policy to determine if a user is accessed. And then we also grant access or deny it right then and there, right? We would call those runtime activities. And then, of course, there's the admin time activities of managing users' policies and so on. I'm going to talk about that. And what I have here are 3 technical illustrations I'm going to show you with real IoT devices. It's not practical for me to bring IoT devices into the conference environment. One of the biggest reasons is because Wi-Fi at conferences, they're not very comfortable letting devices talk to each other, right? That's a security vulnerability. Well, that's part and parcel of what you would want to do with an IoT device. So I brought video to show you those things. Certainly come find me afterwards and we can talk a bit more and I can show you live stuff. All right, here's our first use case, Runtime, secure data center access. How can IoT help with secure data center access? And here the use case is, okay, we have this physicality of IoT platforms. What can we do with it? And so I want you to think about the door panel of the future, the door reader of the future that authenticates users, is cloud-based, can do edge processing on it because it's IoT and all of that good stuff. And let's take a look at that example. So let me see if I can actually, sometimes I have trouble getting the video on the first go, but let me know if you start to see the video. Okay, so first thing here is you have a user. All right, I think we're going. Yeah, we have a user. They present an ID card to this door panel reader. And here's my door panel reader. It's a Raspberry Pi with a touch screen and a camera. No big deal. And here I'm presenting a QR code to the Raspberry Pi reader. Again, think door panel. You're not seeing it. All right. Oh, cool. We got video. Let's start again. Imagine if I actually brought devices, it would be all hell broken loose. But here we have a user who presents an ID card to a door panel, and really what they're presenting to is simply just a Raspberry Pi device with a touch screen and a camera for about 150 bucks. And they're using an ID card here. It has a QR code. There's no specific identity value in that. It's not an authenticator, it's an identifier. And they present it, and the Raspberry Pi, using off-the-shelf code, reads the QR. You can use a mobile device too. In fact, in demos, I frequently use my mobile phone to do that. The device actually sends out a publish message that says, look, I've got this user. This is where he wants to access, in this case, the Sanctum Sanctorum, if you're a Dr. Strange fan. Lambda, the serverless computing, picks up that message, right? It subscribes to it. And then the next thing it says, so I have to take action on this request. And so I've used a NoSQL database, a Dynamo database on AWS, where I've stored my users and policy information. And here you can see I've got about a dozen users. You've got a column here called authorized. If it's true, the user can access the Sanctum Sanctorum, the secure data center of Dr. Strange in New York. If he can't, he won't. Next thing is that the Lambda calls out and using the Duo admin API, authenticates the user using Duo security. Right? So I've done something where I've taken some code and embedded it in Lambda. And Dr. Strange here has access and he hits approved. And then that goes through and then Lambda will log that in CloudWatch. It also sends out a publish message, that same publish message that it saw before, and says, hey, look, this user has got access. And then the device receives that message because it's subscribed to it. Now, in fact, I have sound here, but you don't hear it. The thing actually talks in this oddly British accent and says, you know, welcome, Dr. Strange, or trying to access the Sanctum Sanctorum. So that's a bit where we are. So take a look at some of the metrics here, because I'm making this case around performance and elasticity and edge processing and computing. and better IAM, if you measure the time from when the QR code is read at the door panel, all the way up through publishing to AWS IoT, then hitting the Lambda orchestration function, serverless compute, going to the Dynamo database to check whether that user is authorized or not, and then actually all the way back down to the device to say, yes, that user is authorized, or no, they're not, that's 150 milliseconds round trip. It takes my voice longer to get to the window than it does for that call. Think about some of the traditional items of distributed hybrid cloud and identity and access management and the challenges of doing that. Here's an example where you get blazingly fast speed as a combination of this using this platform, plus using a device that is fast. Again, the hardware cost was about $150. I stopped at about 1,000 users for my scalability testing. Your mileage will vary, but certainly we're talking about a proof of concept. That is our first example. So we talked about runtime, right? So we have authenticated a user, we've used AWS IoT, we've used a Raspberry Pi, we've called out to Duo MFA, we've made the user authenticate to their phone. The next area, and I have 2 technical demos I'd like to show you here to really explore this concept of whether IoT can help identity access management, is how do we actually set this whole process up, right? We just showed you a runtime thing. How do users get into the system? And I want you to think emergency access. Meaning, think about this idea, maybe it's a first responder scenario, maybe it's access to the sanctum sanctorum after it became under attack by Caecilius, again, showing my geek creds with Dr. Strange. If you're not familiar with it, it's fine. Just imagine this scenario where you need to give access to some resources, and it's remote, and the person who needs to do this access isn't an IT wizard. You need to hand them some device and have them be able to actually grant access to things. Here is an example where, as I mentioned before, the users are stored in DynamoDB. DynamoDB is authoritative for these users. Duo security isn't, right? We're pushing identities down to Duo, which means that I would expect to see that this user is this user in yellow or is it orange? I'm colorblind. Is it yellow? Thank you, much appreciated. That's what happens when you turn 50. Everything goes to shit. Pardon my French. It's Sunday. Well, actually, you're not supposed to curse on Sunday, but it's like sort of the early days of the conference. I would expect that user to go away, and I expect some users to come over and be replicated. And I've got a video to show you that. So this is time compressed, so we don't have to wait around too much. All right. Do we see video yet? Okay, I'll back this up, no worries. All right. So again, we're talking about giving a bunch of people access now to the data center on an emergency basis. And what happens is, I'll show you the Dynamo database again. I want you to notice that we've got about 12 users in here that are authorized, or at least could be authorized to access the system, right? They're Dr. Strange and Caecilius and Wong and all the folks that might need access to the data center. But however, if we go to the Duo side of things, Duo knows about 3 users. It knows about Dr. Strange, who's authorized, right? I show you logging in. And then 2 users who are not. They're not authoritative, Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton. So what I do is I press my IoT button. I wish I actually brought it up here. It's about this big. It publishes a message to AWS IoT wirelessly, okay? And it sends a message. It triggers the Lambda function that says, look, we need to do a synchronization of user identities so we can give these users access to this resource, to this data center. So it'll read what's authoritative on Dynamo, it'll see who's in Duo, and then it will obviously do a sync, which means getting rid of some of those users and adding others. And if we go back, we can see that if we go now to Duo, where we had 3 users before, only 1 is authorized. Pretty quickly, we can see that suddenly there are 12 users here. Albert Einstein is gone, he wasn't authorized. Isaac Newton was gone, he's not authorized. And all of the users have been replicated over from DynamoDB into the Duo system. Now, there's some things that need to happen after that, but let's talk about some performance metrics while we're here. So that process of synchronizing users, I had about 1,000 users in it. That process of determining who's in Duo versus who's in the Dynamo database, who's authorized, who isn't, to actually make a list of changes that took less than 2 seconds, okay? So that fits very well within a serverless computing environment, high performance stuff. The process of adding a user to Duo from Dynamo database and enrolling their phone took a little over a second each, okay? The process of deleting the user is 2 API calls. You have to delete the phone, then you delete the user. That was a little under a second. And the hardware cost was $20, which is the cost of that AWS IoT button, which you just click, and it's an IoT device, and you program it, and it's on its way, and it's done. What happens after that, right? All we've done is triggered an enrollment process. So I figured I would just show you this process. Now that we've enabled these users to try and access the secure data center, they haven't really enrolled yet in Duo, right? They haven't finished that process of binding their phone and being able to authenticate to Duo, and I'll show you how that works. So again, once DynamoDB via Lambda synchronizes the users and kicks off this workflow, what we start to see is this. The user gets an enrollment email. You can see here. And of course, we train our users to click on everything, right? So he was probably made aware through education that he was going to get this, and he knows what to do. So he clicks on the enrollment email, and he starts to set up with Duo. And he's going to set up his mobile phone. That's what he wants to use for authentication. Again, based on policy, you can restrict all of these things. He's going to type in the phone number. That's the phone number that came over from DynamoDB, so it's checking the phone number. It says, yep, that's a good phone number, and he says, okay, I need to bind my identity to this phone. So Duo's going to identity proof him by sending a text, and he's going to take that text, and he's going to enter it in here. So he received that on his mobile phone, okay? And now he's choosing a mobile push authentication mechanism. You could restrict this to whatever you wanted to. That's based on policy, but he likes mobile push, and that's it. So now he's fully enrolled, and then at that point, we kick off the process you should be familiar with the Dr. Strange runtime illustration. He's now fully able to access this data center in an emergency access scenario. He's already enrolled in Duo. He's authenticating to the IoT device. The device sends a publish message. AWS, IoT, and Lambda pick it up and verify that he has access, kicks off the authentication, and then he gets access into the building. The door unlocks. Just like that. Let's talk a bit more about what this, some recommendations here. When you're building trustworthy devices, use higher assurance credentials. If you're thinking about handling the live genetic material of user authentications, you need to be thinking about high assurance credentials for the device itself. Makes sense, right? Now, the beautiful thing is that certificates, you would think is a relatively complicated phenomenon. With IoT, it really isn't. Many of them support certificates, and the peanut butter and jelly approach, common things put together is MQTT plus certificate, right? That's built into the toolkits, everything else. Now, if you can't use certificates, for example, Oracle's IoT platform does not support certificates, right? It's all symmetric key based. Then you want to rotate these credentials. You certainly want to rotate certificate-based credentials, right? But certainly that takes a lot. You have years potentially to do that, or sooner. But if you're doing more common things, you want to rotate more frequently. The platforms can help you with this. So in other words, using AWS Secrets or Key Manager, you can facilitate some, and Lambda, right? Facilitate some orchestration of changing credentials across applications within the infrastructure as a service platform, but also on the device. Now, to do it across platform, which is a common problem our organizations are struggling with, our clients. Now, this is our use case here where we're managing stuff within AWS and we're using IoT within AWS, but then we're calling out to Duo. That means we're storing Duo key material, right? Now, I've done the right thing. I've taken it out of the code. I've taken it out of the Lambda code. But how do I actually update the admin API key in Duo and in AWS? Inter-platform support. And that's where this is an emerging area, and we're not really quite there yet, and you would expect to see more developments in this area. Hardware storage, consider this. A lot of devices, GSM-based, you might be able to use hardware storage. A lot of devices have hardware storage built into them. Now there's a whole aftermarket set of products that are doing hardware storage, hardware root of trust for example, on a Raspberry Pi or other things. It's a FIPS compliant device. You drop it on, and it, if you're familiar with all this stuff, it talks PKCS11 to the Pi and protects the credentials. That's getting better, and we're also starting to see the emergence of what I would call an IoT identity market, where you have folks like Venafi and Entrust Data Card who are saying, look, that process, that lifecycle process of managing credentials on the devices really aren't equipped to do it. And the IoT platforms and IaaS vendors aren't equipped to do it. So they're kind of stepping in the middle to say, okay, we'll give you a toolkit, it'll be easy, and we'll change the credentials on the device, and then we'll change the credential in your IoT platform. Those guys don't want to become IoT platforms with orchestration and repositories and everything else. Their little slice of the pie that they want is just to make the credential rotation process easier. And finally, in the case of our example, you will probably want to secure a door panel, right? So it's commensurate with risk. We still have physical access being king. You need to make sure that you secure your devices in a manner that's commensurate with the risks that you're taking and the identity credentialing material you're handling. We've talked about this era of orchestration, using serverless computing like Lambda and Azure Functions to do this. Use key management, I've mentioned this before. This is an area commonly where we know, talking to our clients, this is a place where we see attack points, attack surfaces. Use standards. For example, using certificates in MQTT is going to make your life a whole lot easier. If you're using the kind of unconstrained device that I've been showing you, it's going to work pretty well. Here's a hard part and the dirty secret about infrastructure as a service in general, but also the Internet of Things. And that is that it's too easy to over-entitle within IaaS and IoT because it's so hard to get it right. How many people have actually set up an IaaS environment and tried to restrict entitlements, and then whatever they did broke? Yeah, more than a few, right? So it's really hard to get this right. What you want to do from a development perspective is get it running, and then before you move into production, really spend time with the security team actually orchestrating downward and know exactly what you've enabled for all of these functions. This is certainly an area of exploration. This is a bit of the Wild West still, this idea of using IoT for IAM. Be prepared to blaze a trail. There isn't a lot ahead of you so far. It's a forward-thinking topic, but there is stuff happening. Evaluate your use cases carefully, right? Think about it. And the areas where a lot of our clients have had success is when they have a traditional software on-premises solution that's in place, and they're re-architecting the whole thing, right? They're doing a refactor of it, and they're moving to platforms, and there's a role for the IoT to play with their identity and access management in that regard. And then I mentioned some vendors before, but certainly look at the IoT platforms and the IaaS vendors themselves to see continued identity and access management enhancements, things like better credential rotation and so on. That's coming, right? This is very much an emerging area. Just to wrap up and ask the question one more time, do we think that IoT is going to improve the way we do IAM? I personally think that's true. A lot of the clients I have think that it's true. And there are a lot of compelling reasons for it. This high performance, the fact that you can do edge processing on the device, the fact that you can have cost reduction as part of this, the fact that you have elasticity that's built into the IoT platforms themselves, as well as AI and machine learning. This certainly is an area up and coming to explore, and I think based on what we're seeing among our clients, it's a trend that's happening already. It's nascent, but it's coming. With that in mind, I've got about 90 seconds for Q&A. And after that, for respect for the next speaker, I'm going to unplug and I'd be happy to meet you right outside the door and we can ask questions as well. So why don't we start? Or did you just drink way too much scotch in the North End last night and you're all hungover? Do you have a question?
What were the two companies you mentioned in the identity marketplace?
So some of the vendors that are, I would call them identity IoT helping apps, like they're changing credentials on devices and changing them to the platform. You would want to look at Venafi and you would want to look at Entrust Data Card. In particular, Entrust Data Card is a product called IOTrust that, again, those guys have been building PKI toolkits forever, so they're just, this is kind of a pivot for them. They're trying to find their way into that market. That's a great question. Oh, by the way, the slides will be available to you tomorrow if that's something you're interested in as well. They're updating all the conference stuff, so if you want to grab these slides tomorrow, that's great. Otherwise, any other questions? Yes?
Quick question with that. So the other side of this sometimes, from our organization, is the regulatory aspect of this.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not auditors recognize this as one of the proofs for compliance. Can you sort of speak to that development?
I think it sort of depends on what the compliance initiative is. So without giving you a very specific answer to your vertical, certainly when you start looking at some of the GDPR elements, there are elements of privacy and trust that I think might fit well within this. But we could talk certainly offline, talk more specifically about your environment. All right, cool. So I'm coming down. I've got like 5 seconds left, so I'm gonna wrap up. If you have any questions, I'm going to be hanging out in the back, and we can go from there. Many thanks for coming to the session today, too. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you around at the rest of the conference.